And I know IMF established a new regional center in Shanghai. So what are the considerations for setting a new center in Shanghai? And what opportunities do you think this center will bring for financial stability and cooperation in China and Asian Pacific region?
It was really appropriate that we announced the establishment of the Shanghai Center in June in Shanghai at the Lujiazui Forum with the PBOC governor, Governor Pan. Why? Because actually it's a joint initiative with the central bank. So the purpose of the center is to increase our engagement in the dynamic Asia-Pacific region. And why do I say dynamic? If we look at Asia-Pacific, and let's narrow to just middle-income countries in Asia-Pacific, you realize that last year, middle-income Asia accounted for more than half of global growth. And we actually expect a similar result this year. I'm really looking forward to the Shanghai Regional Center. It will increase our presence in the region. It will give us a better perspective, and we believe it will also promote international cooperation.
Early August, IMF released a very important report, and affirming China's economy is still very resilient, and you raised China's annual economic growth outlook to 5%. So, Steve, what do you think are main aspects of the persistence of Chinese economy?
We talked about resilience. I think there's really two factors we should think about. I think first we need a global context. Since the pandemic, the global economy has lost more than 3% of output. And if we look at global growth, this year our latest forecast is for 3.2% global growth. In the 2 decades before the pandemic, global growth averaged 3.8%. So we have a global economy that's still growing much slower than pre-pandemic average. So one aspect of resilience is seeing what's happening in China in the global context. The second aspect is really what's happening in China itself. And in particular, it's not just the pandemic in China, it's also having a real estate correction. So this correction is both welcome and necessary. And at the end of the day, to link these two topics together, robust growth in China is obviously good for China. It's also good for the global economy. You know, we estimate that China is accounting for roughly 30% of global growth this year. So faster growth in China can also lift global demand.
According to the National Bureau of Statistics of China, the China's economy grew 5% in the early half of the year, which is in line with the expectation from IMF. So, Steve, how would you evaluate the change rate of China's economy in the early half of the year? And what is the outlook for the second half of the year?
As you noted, so far this year, in the first half of the year, the economy grew 5%. 60% of that growth came from consumption. So you asked what's the outlook for the rest of the year. I would argue what we hope the outlook for the rest of the year, and not just this year, but the years going forward, would be to continue this pattern being where consumption is the main contributor to GDP growth. We think there's a lot of room. I think, at the end of the day, for China to succeed in having a long period where consumption grows faster than GDP, there's a very technical way to saying living standards are also growing faster than GDP. So it's good for the Chinese economy.
No long ago, China held the third plenary session of the 20th Central Committee of the CPC. And it stated that we should pay more attention to improve the institutions and mechanisms for the higher quality of economic growth. So, Steve, I know you are the representative of IMF to China. You pay attention to the reform and opening up and the economic transition of China for a long time. I know you mentioned many times that the quality of the China's economic growth is more important than the quantity. Why would you say that? And what's your comment on this?
I've had the privilege of covering China for the IMF for actually more than 20 years. So I have seen firsthand, and I have also seen in the data, China's impressive development over the last several decades. It's not a growth miracle. China's impressive development is the direct consequence of the policies China pursued to generate that growth. And I think coming back to your question, how did they do that? Primarily it was market-oriented reforms that helped unleash the productivity in the economy. Us economists love this term total factor productivity. It's a fancy way of saying better allocation of resources. And if we look at the recent documents, so you mentioned the communique from the third-party plenum. I also like the government work report from the recent March 2 meetings. Both of those reports explicitly mention total factor productivity. And I think they had the key aspects to generate this growth over time. And what are those? One is give the market a decisive role in the allocation of resources. The second is to ensure a level playing field between all types of firms, whether they're state-owned, private-owned, or foreign-owned. And the third one is to create a really strong business environment that is law-based and market-oriented. You know, with all of these reforms, we can continue to have productivity growth in China, and that can drive sustainable growth.
IMF paid great attention to the sustainable development, and you emphasize that the economic recovery and growth should be intact of the sustainability. So, and China currently, as you can see, we are trying to do the green transitions in all areas around the country, and we are working hard to develop the green industry. So, what new momentum do you think the new green industry will inject into the sustainability of Chinese economy?
As you know, the IMF is really focused on climate change issues. You know, we see that China is on track to beat the goal of carbon peak by 2030. So we think the carbon will peak in China before 2030. And we see that China is also the global leader in installed capacity of renewable energy. But you know, if we step back a bit and we look at the many challenges facing the global economy today, we have to put climate change up there at the top of the list. And I think it's also indicative of a deeper principle. No one country can solve climate change alone, and it's a great example that the international community has to work together in order to take on problems like climate change.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.